Hey, special educators, I'm Jennifer from Positively Learning. Welcome to the Special Educators Resource Room. If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to save time and streamline your work. That's why this podcast was created, to give you the systems and solutions you need to get your time back. Tune in for tips, tricks, and tools that will help you manage your workload and make the most of your time. Whether you're brand new or experienced, all are welcome in the Special Educators Resource Room. Hey, it's Jennifer from Positively Learning. All right, this episode is all about accommodations versus modifications, but I promise you this is not going to be simply defining the terms I know you can Google, but instead talking about what we can do with this information, whether you are sitting at the IEP meeting table advocating for students, or maybe you are the go-to reference at your school for all things special education. So let's get these definitions out of the way. Well, it's actually pretty understandable how accommodations and modifications can get mixed up. We often hear the terms in the same sentence or conversation. Maybe we even see them on the same form, almost like they're interchangeable, which we definitely know they are not. So let's start with the definition of an accommodation. An accommodation is a support that's put into place that helps a student access the general education curriculum. So the expectations of that curriculum have not changed. All students are held to that same grade level standard. The purpose of an accommodation is to give students equal access to the opportunities that the rest of the class has. Now, I'm sure you can think of many different examples of accommodations. I know some common ones that I've seen are extended time or preferential seating, maybe the use of assistive technology like a calculator, a graphic organizer, or a word bank. One other example that I've seen are having a test problem read out loud. So this is an accommodation because all students are seeing the same test problems. But by reading out loud that test problem to a student with this accommodation, you're giving them access to that. All right, so now let's define modification. Plain and simple, a modification is a change. Something in the curriculum is being changed. So an accommodation is providing access to that general education curriculum, and modification, we're changing the curriculum, whether we're changing the instructional level, the actual content, or the performance criteria. So this could be using an alternative curriculum or textbook, or maybe students are taking an alternative assignment or assessment. And in my experience, when we're making these changes, these alternative options are below the grade level expectation. So unofficially, I think of modifications as much more serious. I would want to put an accommodation in place, but if an accommodation isn't providing that access, then I would look at modifications. All right, so what do we actually do with this information? Well, I know that I am leaning on that definition of accommodations when I'm sitting in conversations, deciding what accommodation is appropriate for a student. I want to think about that word access. We don't want to put too many accommodations on there if they're not necessary. We only want to put an accommodation that is increasing access to the general education curriculum. And it should be a yes or a no. Does this increase access? Yes or no? Is it necessary for a student to gain access to the general education curriculum? That's a yes or a no. So we don't want to just layer them on there, but instead we want to make sure it's the correct accommodation and that it's necessary. On the other side, I want to make sure that we're not changing that student's experience with the curriculum. We're just providing access to it. We want to make sure we are not making any changes because, of course, that would be a whole nother conversation about modifications. So now let's assume that the appropriate accommodations have been determined and they have been officially, I'm using air quotes, I know you can't see me, but they've been officially added to the student's current IEP. Now, who's actually going to provide these accommodations? Well, because they are on the IEP, which is a legal document, this student has the right to receive those accommodations wherever they are. whether they are with you as a special education teacher or they are in the general education setting. So the answer to that, who provides them? Anyone working with that child is to provide those accommodations. I think of it this way. Because it's on the IEP, if that student would leave your classroom and say that they moved to a new school to cross town, that student from day one in that new school has the right to those accommodations because that's on the IEP. Now, I know in our own experiences, it doesn't feel like this, right? We know that accommodations may not be provided anywhere that student goes, but it's important information and where we can advocate that that student has the right to that because we have determined they're appropriate and we've added them to the IEP. All right, now moving forward. If you are still listening, thank you very much. You may have thought this information was helpful, but it wasn't really brand new information. But maybe you're finding yourself in a scenario where accommodations are not being provided across the board. And I'm here to say, I hear you and I've experienced that myself. So what I want to do is arm you with some knowledge. When I have found myself in that situation where accommodations are not being fully provided, it usually falls into two different buckets. The first one is sheer overwhelm, where maybe accommodations are not being provided because they're waiting on me as the special educator to help out. And that is one type of conversation. But I really want to think about the other bucket. And this one still blows my mind, but I've seen it happen many times before. It's where an accommodation is not being provided because maybe this educator doesn't think it's necessary. Maybe they think, oh, the student's doing so well, we don't need to provide these. Or maybe it's, that's not fair. Why should that student be getting all that help? And that, of course, is a different conversation we need to have. So what I want to do is give you that knowledge because you may be the advocate or the reference tool at your school. So, of course, you could provide training, whether it's to all staff, like a PD, or it's with your support staff that you're working with day in, day out. But maybe you're not giving any kind of official training. So instead, this information could be shared through a conversation. So one of my favorite ways to both teach and learn is to use examples. So one idea, whether you are officially giving a PD training or whether you are just having a conversation, is to provide examples starting way out at the surface level of accommodations versus modifications. You can have examples of both and you would almost sort them. Which one's which? In fact, I have a done for you PD on this topic. It's inside the big special educators bundle and it has the slides and the definitions, but I also have a activity that you could use as either an icebreaker, which is a huge eye roll, I know, or you could use it as an activity like during the professional development. But what it is a list of accommodations and a list of modifications, and educators would work together to sort them. And the whole idea, of course, is to provide opportunities to have a conversation, like which one's which and how do you know, just deepening our understanding. But if I was having a conversation with someone who was definitely like falling in that bucket of thinking, like, why is this necessary? I would want to dig deeper into just accommodations and talking about those access points and using that simple yes, no, providing an example or non-example of an accommodation and thinking, does this provide access? Yes or no? And then you can have that conversation. Maybe that's when you can find out a little bit more about what this educator's thinking. I mean, we all have the same goal, right? For our students to receive a fair and appropriate education and to do well and to enjoy learning. We all have that same goal, but we may have different ways of getting there. Now, we know that accommodations are legal and they have to be provided, but it would be really helpful to learn more about why this educator doesn't feel that way. What are they actually thinking about these accommodations? If we have some examples and some non-examples, and we can start talking about why one would provide access where another one would not, that can help us understand better so we can not only support our students, but we can better support the educators that we're working with as well. All right, I'm starting off a whole new tangent, and I think this should be a whole nother episode. So I'm definitely going to put it on the radar to come back and talk more about classroom accommodations. If you have any questions about them, be sure to let me know, and I will do my best to answer them in a very near episode. But I want to thank you so much for sticking with me and listening. Definitely check out the show notes. It has a lot of the information we've provided. It's a blog post. It also has the infographic that you can share out with your own staff and get everybody on the same page. So thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will catch you next time in the Special Educators Resource Room. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm dying to ask, what'd you think? Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe buttons so that you never miss an episode. You can find the show notes and links for everything mentioned in this episode at positivelylearningblog.com. See you next week for more special education solutions.